February 1st, 1943, 07:45 hours, and Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg grips the control yoke of his B-17 Flying Fortress, watching 12 bombers of the 97th Bomb Group climb through the morning sky over Biskra, Algeria. The formation is heading northwest toward the Mediterranean coast, toward the German-controlled ports of Bizerte and Tunis, where Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps desperately needs supplies to continue their North African campaign. Bragg's bomber carries a name painted on her nose in proud letters, All American, chosen by the pilot himself who played football for Duke University before the war turned him into a combat aviator. What Lieutenant Bragg cannot possibly know, what none of the 10 men aboard his aircraft could imagine as they settle into their position for the 3-hour flight to target, is that within hours his Flying Fortress will become the subject of one of the most famous photographs of World War II and prove beyond any doubt why Boeing's 4-engine bomber earned its legendary reputation for bringing crews home against impossible odds. The mission briefing at dawn had been straightforward enough, hitting the docks at Tunis to disrupt German supply lines, flying without fighter escort because the P-38 Lightnings assigned to protect them would rendezvous over the target. The 12 B-17 represents a tiny force by the standards that will dominate the skies over Europe in later years, but in early 1943 in North Africa, this is what the 8th Air Force can muster. The men aboard All American are veterans by this point, having flown multiple missions from their base in the Sahara Desert, and they know what to expect from German defences. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters based at airfields around Tunis are aggressive and skilled. Their pilots experienced in attacking American bombers, and the flak over the target will be intense, throwing up curtains of exploding steel that can tear an aircraft apart in seconds. But the B-17 has proven itself capable of absorbing tremendous punishment, and the crews have confidence in their aircraft, in their training, and in each other. Inside All American, each crew member occupies a position that has become as familiar as home over the months of training and combat. Bombardier Ralph Burbridge sits in the nose, surrounded by the Norden bomb site and his gun, responsible for guiding the bombs to target when the moment comes. Navigator Harry Nussel works at his table with maps and instruments, plotting their course across hostile territory where a navigation error could mean flying into concentrated flak or missing the fighter rendezvous. Up in the cockpit with Bragg, co-pilot Godfrey Boyd monitors the instruments and engine gauges, watching for any sign of mechanical trouble that might force them to abort. Engineer Joe James stands between the pilots, ready to manage fuel flow and troubleshoot problems, his intimate knowledge of the B-17 systems making him invaluable. Radio operator Paul Galloway mans his position behind the bomb bay, maintaining contact with the formation and listening for coded messages from base. Bull turret gunner Elton Conder has squeezed himself into the spherical turret beneath the aircraft, suspended in space with nothing but plexiglass between him and the ground thousands of feet below. Waist gunners Michael Zook and another crewman stand at their positions on either side of the fuselage, their 50 caliber machine guns ready to repel fighter attacks from the beam. And in the tail, isolated from the rest of the crew by the length of the fuselage, tail gunner Sam Sarpalus occupies the loneliest position on the aircraft, watching their rear for enemy fighters approaching from the vulnerable 6 o'clock position. The flight to target proceeds without incident as the formation crosses the desert and approaches the Mediterranean coastline, where the water changes from blue to green and white as waves break against Tunisian beaches. The B-17CS maintain tight formation, each aircraft positioned so their combined defensive firepower creates overlapping fields of fire, the standard tactic that gives bomber formations their best chance of survival against fighter attack. The theory is simple. Any German fighter approaching the formation will face concentrated fire from multiple machine guns, making attack runs extremely dangerous for the enemy pilots. But German fighter pilots have developed tactics to counter this defense, including head-on attacks that expose them to fire for the shortest possible time while targeting the bomber's weakest defensive position, the nose where only the bombardier's single gun can return fire. These frontal attacks require tremendous courage and precise timing, with the fighter pilot boring in at closing speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour, firing his cannon and machine guns in short bursts before breaking away at the last possible second to avoid collision. As All American approaches Tunis, the formation spots the first fighters, small specks against the sky that rapidly grow into the distinctive shapes of Messerschmitt Bf-109s, their angular wings and narrow fuselages unmistakable. The German fighters are climbing to altitude, positioning themselves for attacks, and Bragg alerts his crew over the intercom to prepare for action. The gunners swing their weapons toward the approaching threats, charging their guns and settling into their sights, each man knowing that the next few minutes will determine whether they live or die. The fighter attacks begin with a fury that surprises even these experienced crews as the Messerschmitts come in from multiple angles, their guns flickering with muzzle flashes. The lead bomber in the formation, Flaming Mamie, flown by Major Robert Coulter with his regular pilot Lieutenant Jesse Wickel in the co-pilot seat, takes the brunt of the initial attack. Two BF-109s make simultaneous head-on passes, their 20mm cannons and machine guns pouring fire into the bomber's nose and engines. Among the attacking fighters is Feldwebel Erich Paxier, a 16-victory ace from the 6th Squadron of Jagdgeschwader 53, flying a tropical configuration Bf-109G. Paxier is experienced and deadly, having survived dozens of combat missions over the Mediterranean, and he knows how to kill bombers. Another German pilot, Julius Meinberg of the 11th Squadron, sets up for his own frontal attack, having spent weeks perfecting this dangerous tactic against American heavy bombers. Both pilots commit to their attack simultaneously, diving toward the formation at full throttle, their fighters accelerating to maximum speed as they close the distance. The American gunners respond immediately, tracers reaching out toward the attacking fighters like accusatory fingers, filling the sky with streams of .50 caliber fire. Meinberg's attack succeeds in damaging his target, but as he pulls away, his Bf-109's oxygen tanks are hit and burst into flames. He has seconds to bail out, pulling his aircraft into a climb to give himself altitude before releasing his harness and tumbling into space with severe burns that will send him back to Germany for months of recovery. Paxier lines up on All-American, flying directly toward Bragg's aircraft with his guns blazing. From the nose, Burbridge opens fire with his single machine gun, watching his tracers arc toward the approaching fighter. The German pilot's cannon shells and machine gun rounds slam into All-American's forward section, punching holes through thin aluminum skin, but Burbridge keeps firing, leading his target perfectly as the distance closes to hundreds of yards, then hundreds of feet. In the cockpit, Bragg and Boyd watch the Bf-109 growing larger in their windscreen, with terrifying speed, its propeller a blur, its guns still firing. The combined defensive fire from All-American and the other bombers in formation find their mark, multiple .50 caliber rounds striking Paxier's fighter. The German pilot is hit, either killed instantly or wounded so severely that he cannot control his aircraft. His Bf-109 should roll away and dive toward the desert below, but instead it continues straight ahead on a collision course with All-American. Bragg has perhaps 2 seconds to react as he realizes the fighter is not going to break away. He rams the control yoke forward with all his strength, trying to push All-American's nose down to duck beneath the incoming fighter. Boyd adds his own strength to the controls, both pilots straining against the yoke, while their bomber responds with agonizing slowness. The Bf-109 screams over the cockpit with inches to spare, close enough that Bragg could see details of the fighter's tropical paint scheme, close enough to hear the howl of its engine over the roar of All-American's own motors, but the German fighter's wing does not clear All-American's tail. Instead, it slices through the rear fuselage like a giant blade, the impact sending a shudder through the entire aircraft. The Bf-109 disintegrates on contact, its wing tearing away from the fuselage, pieces of German fighter lodging in the American bomber as the rest tumbles toward the earth, carrying the body of Erich Paxier, who will be buried in the German war cemetery at Bourg Cedria in Tunisia. Inside All-American, the crew feels the collision as a massive thud that travels through the airframe, followed immediately by a violent yaw to the right. Bragg fights the controls, trying to level the aircraft, but something is terribly wrong. The control yoke feels loose, the trim tabs that normally allow fine adjustments to the flight path are not responding, and the bomber wants to climb uncontrollably. Only by applying constant forward pressure with his knees and hands can Bragg keep the nose down enough to maintain something resembling level flight. Boyd shuts down 2 of the 4 engines, both on the right side because they have been damaged by German cannon fire and are smoking ominously. Now, All-American is flying on 2 engines with unknown damage to the rear fuselage, over enemy territory, with German fighters still prowling nearby. Bragg keys the intercom to check on his crew, asking for damage reports from each position, and the responses paint a picture of catastrophe that should mean the death of his aircraft. From the radio room, Paul Galloway reports that he can see daylight where there should be none. Looking aft into the fuselage reveals twisted metal and torn cables. The waist gunners report that the entire tail section appears to be hanging on by a thread, connected to the main fuselage only by a few strips of metal and part of the radio equipment. The left horizontal stabilizer, the wing-like surface that helps control pitch, is completely gone, torn away by the collision. The vertical stabilizer and rudder are damaged but still attached, though they are twisting and flexing in ways that make the gunners sick to watch. Most critically, the tail gunner Sam Sarpalus is trapped in his position, unable to move forward through the wreckage, isolated in a section of aircraft that appears ready to tear away at any moment. The fuselage has been cut almost completely through, leaving a gaping wound 16 feet long and 4 feet wide at its maximum, through which the sky and desert are visible. Control cables that run the length of the bomber to operate the tail surfaces have been severed, with only a single elevator cable still intact, giving Bragg minimal control over the aircraft's pitch. Burbridge, making his way back from the nose to assess the damage, describes the scene as being like looking at a tin can that someone has attacked with a giant can opener. Metal is flapping in the slipstream, wires are dangling loose, and pieces of the German fighter, including a section of wing, are wedged into the wreckage. The other bombers in formation, seeing all Americans' damage, assume the aircraft is going down and begin calling for the crew to bail out while they still can, but Bragg makes a decision that defines his character and his faith in his aircraft. He tells his crew they are going to try to fly this broken bomber back to base, that they will not abandon All American unless she proves she cannot fly. This decision is not made from ego or false bravado, but from a realistic assessment of their situation. They are over enemy territory. Bailing out means becoming prisoners of war if they survive the parachute descent, and Bragg believes the B-17 can make it home if they are careful. The crew agrees, each man knowing that their survival now depends on keeping this shattered aircraft in the sky for over 2 hours and 90 miles, back to Biskra. The bomb run proceeds despite the damage, because turning away from the target would mean wasting the mission and the risks already taken. Burbridge guides the bombs to the docks at Tunis, and when the bomb bay doors open, the turbulence created by the wind rushing through the damaged fuselage becomes so severe that one of the waist gunners is literally blown into the tail section. It takes 4 crew members and improvised ropes made from parachute cords several minutes to haul him back to the forward fuselage, a rescue operation performed while flying over enemy territory at a reduced speed. They consider trying to bring Sarpalus forward from the tail, but when they begin pulling on the ropes, the entire tail section starts flapping so violently that it begins to separate further. The crew realizes that Sarpalus's weight in the tail is actually providing stability, acting as a counterweight that helps keep the damaged section from tearing off completely. Sarpalus volunteers to remain at his position despite being cut off from the rest of the crew, knowing his presence there might save everyone's lives. Bragg begins the turn for home, but this cannot be a normal banking turn because the forces involved might tear the tail away completely. Instead, he executes an excruciatingly slow, gentle turn that takes All American nearly 70 miles to complete a 180-degree course reversal. The aircraft is losing altitude steadily, unable to maintain its original bombing altitude on 2 engines, with the massive drag created by the damaged tail section. And within minutes, All American is alone in the sky, having fallen behind the formation. This isolation makes them vulnerable to further fighter attacks. And sure enough, 2 more Bf-109s spot the crippled bomber and move in for what should be an easy kill. But the American gunners, despite their aircraft being barely controllable and missing much of its rear fuselage, fight back with a ferocity born of desperation. The waist gunners stand with their heads protruding through the torn top of the fuselage to aim their weapons, firing at the attacking fighters with controlled bursts. Sarpalus in the tail fires in short bursts as well, because he discovers that the recoil from sustained fire causes the entire tail section to twist, threatening to break away. The combined fire is enough to discourage the German pilots, who break off their attacks after a few passes, perhaps unwilling to press home attacks against an already doomed bomber, or perhaps running low on fuel and ammunition. The flight back to Biskra becomes a test of skill and endurance that pushes Bragg and his co-pilot to their limits. They must maintain constant pressure on the controls to keep All American from climbing uncontrollably, their arms and legs aching from the sustained effort. Every moment they expect to feel the bomber shudder as the tail finally tears away, sending them into an uncontrollable spin from which there will be no recovery. The crew maintains radio contact with Allied fighters that intercept them as they approach friendly territory, and the P-38 pilots radioing ahead to Biskra describe the tail as waving like a fishtail, expressing their belief that All American will never make it to the coast. They suggest that boats be positioned to rescue the crew when they bail out over the Mediterranean, but Bragg signals his intention to stay with the aircraft and attempt a landing. The fighter pilots stay with All American, relaying hand signals from Bragg to the base because the bomber's radios have been damaged in the collision. 2.5 hours after the collision over Tunis, All-American approaches Biskra airfield with all 10 crew members still aboard. Ground crews and personnel gather along the runway, having heard the radio reports about the damaged bomber, expecting to witness either a miraculous landing or a catastrophic crash. Bragg lines up for his final approach from 40 miles out, giving himself maximum time to get the alignment perfect because he will have only one chance at this landing. The tailwheel is inoperative, destroyed in the collision, so the landing will have to be made on the main gear only, requiring precise control at touchdown to prevent the tail from dragging and potentially tearing completely away. All-American descends toward the desert runway with its tail section visibly flexing and twisting, held together by nothing more than strips of metal and the skill of its pilots. Bragg maintains his approach speed perfectly, neither too fast nor too slow, feeling for the ground through controls that barely respond to his inputs. The main landing gear touches down on the rough desert runway with a jarring impact that travels through the damaged airframe. Bragg holds the nose up as long as possible to keep weight off the damaged tail, letting the bomber roll along on its main gear while gradually losing speed. Only when the aircraft has slowed to taxiing speed does he allow the tail to settle, and the lack of a functioning tailwheel causes the rear fuselage to drag along the runway, raising clouds of dust. But All-American holds together, the tail section refusing to separate. Despite all the stress it has endured, Bragg brings the bomber to a complete stop on the runway and shuts down the 2 remaining engines, the sudden silence after hours of engine noise seeming almost unnatural. Ground crews rush toward the aircraft with an ambulance in tow, expecting casualties, but Bragg waves them off. Not a single member of his crew has been injured. 10 men climbed into All-American before dawn, and 10 men climb out after one of the most remarkable flights in aviation history. The crew exits the aircraft carefully, helping each other down through the waist positions because the normal entry door is blocked by wreckage. Sarpalis climbs down from the tail using a ladder brought by ground crews, finally able to leave his isolated position after hours of sitting in what should have been a coffin. As the last crew member touches the ground, the entire tail section, no longer supported by the weight of the gunner and held together only by the most tenuous connections, collapses onto the runway with a grinding crash. The timing is almost theatrical, as if All-American held herself together just long enough to deliver her crew safely, and then gave up the struggle. Ground crews and photographers swarm the aircraft, documenting the damage for reports that will eventually reach Boeing's engineers in Seattle. Lieutenant Charles Cutforth, a crew member aboard another B-17 in the formation, has his camera and takes photographs of the crippled bomber during the flight home, images that will become some of the most famous pictures of World War II. The photographs reveal the full extent of the damage in stark detail. The left horizontal stabilizer is completely absent, torn away at its root. The vertical stabilizer and rudder are bent and twisted, covered with tears and holes. The fuselage has been cut through at an angle, leaving a massive diagonal gash that exposes the interior structure of the aircraft. Daylight is visible through the tail from multiple angles, and it appears impossible that this collection of twisted metal could have flown at all, much less made a controlled landing. Boeing engineers, when they later examine the photographs and damage reports, state flatly that according to all known principles of aeronautical engineering, All-American should not have been able to fly with this damage. The loss of the left horizontal stabilizer alone should have made the aircraft uncontrollable. The severed control cables should have prevented the pilots from maintaining any semblance of directional control, and the massive drag from the damaged tail section should have caused an immediate stall. Yet the B-17 flew, brought home by the skill of its crew and the inherent strength of its design. The story of All-American spreads rapidly through the Allied forces in North Africa and eventually reaches newspapers in the United States, where it becomes a symbol of American determination and the toughness of the Flying Fortress. The famous singer Eddie Cantor dedicates the hit song "Comin' In on a Wing and a Prayer" to Bragg and his crew, though the song was actually written about another damaged bomber's return. The phrase becomes permanently associated with All-American's February 1st mission, capturing the essence of a flight that seemed to defy every law of physics and probability. The 414th Bombardment Squadron adopts a new unit badge inspired by the incident, featuring an image of a puppy praying atop a damaged tail section, a humorous but heartfelt acknowledgement of the miraculous nature of their survival. Fellow crews treat Bragg and his men with a mixture of respect and awe, knowing they have witnessed something that should not have been possible. All American herself receives repairs at the hands of skilled mechanics who work to graft a new tail section onto the damaged forward fuselage. The repair work is complicated by the field conditions, done in the desert without the proper facilities or equipment that would be available at a major depot, but the mechanics manage to make the bomber airworthy again. The riveting work required to join the new tail to the old fuselage, however, creates problems that will plague All American for the rest of her service life. The repaired aircraft never flies quite right, suffering from speed problems and handling quirks that stem from the field repairs. She flies one more combat mission, attacking an airfield in Sicily in May 1943, but her performance is so degraded that she is removed from frontline combat duties and relegated to utility work, carrying cargo and personnel, weather reconnaissance and training flights. The marriage of the forward section and the new tail section looks good on the ground, but in the air, All American is extremely slow and plagued with problems that no amount of maintenance can fully correct. The aircraft's combat career effectively ends with that February mission, though she continues serving in non-combat roles for another 2 years before finally being scrapped in March 1945. By that time, the B-17 has been largely replaced by the B-24 Liberator and the even more advanced B-29 Superfortress, and there is no longer any need for a patched-together bomber with questionable flight characteristics. But the legend of All American lives on, growing with each retelling, sometimes embellished with dramatic details that never actually happened. Stories circulate that the crew used parachute cords to physically hold the tail section in place, that they performed dramatic in-flight rescues, that they completed their bomb run after the collision rather than before. These embellishments, while making for better stories, are unnecessary because the truth is dramatic enough without invention. The real story, as confirmed by surviving crew members in interviews conducted decades later, is remarkable precisely because it involves no Hollywood heroics, just skilled pilots flying a damaged aircraft with extreme care and a crew working together to survive. Ralph Burbridge, the bombardier, gives interviews in later years that carefully correct the fictional accounts, explaining exactly what happened and what did not happen on that February day. He emphasizes the skill of both Bragg and co-pilot Boyd, noting that co-pilots rarely receive adequate recognition for their role despite being essential to the aircraft's operation. He also credits the other bombers in the formation for staying with All American once they were out of enemy territory, providing moral support and witness to the drama unfolding, and the Allied fighters for their protection and communication relay that allowed the damaged bomber to make it home. The technical achievement represented by All American's survival goes beyond the bravery of her crew to speak to the fundamental soundness of the B-17's design. Boeing's engineers created an aircraft with redundancy and structural strength that allowed it to absorb catastrophic damage and continue flying. The B-17 Flying Fortress earned its reputation for bringing crews home in countless incidents throughout World War II, from bombers landing with engines shot out, to aircraft with massive holes blown through their wings and fuselages by flak, to planes that collided with each other in formation yet managed to reach friendly territory. All American represents the most extreme example of this survivability, the bomber that absolutely should not have flown but did anyway, because every element of her design, from the structural strength of her airframe to the layout of her control systems, provided margins of safety that proved adequate even in circumstances that exceeded all design specifications. The men who flew All American home that day carried the experience with them for the rest of their lives, forever aware of how close they came to death and how much they owed to their aircraft and each other. Sam Sarplus bore a scar on his back from a bullet wound received during the mission, a wound he carried for decades as a physical reminder of those hours spent isolated in the damaged tail. Kendrick Bragg returned to civilian life after the war, having earned the deep respect of everyone who knew what he accomplished over the Tunisian desert. The other crew members scattered across America after demobilization, carrying photographs and memories of a day when they rode a broken bomber through hostile skies and somehow survived. They attended reunions in later years, gathering to share memories and ensure that the true story of their mission was preserved against the inevitable distortions of time and embellishment. Today, fewer than 40 B-17 Flying Fortresses survive in complete form, preserved in museums or maintained in flying condition by dedicated groups who understand the historical importance of these aircraft. None of these survivors bears the scars that All American carried, the massive diagonal cut through the fuselage and the missing stabilizer that made her famous. Those scars exist only in the famous photographs taken during and after her flight home, images that continue to circulate on the internet and in books about World War II aviation. The photographs serve as testament to what American engineering and American courage accomplished in the darkest days of global conflict, when young men climbed into aluminum machines and flew them into the teeth of enemy defenses because the mission required it and their comrades depended on them. All Americans' flight on February 1st, 1943 stands as perhaps the single most dramatic demonstration of the B-17 Flying Fortress's ability to absorb punishment and bring its crew home. A flight that should have ended in a fatal crash, but instead ended with 10 men walking away from an aircraft that refused to give up as long as her crew needed her. The legacy of that mission extends beyond the specific aircraft and crew to influence how aviation engineers think about survivability and redundancy in aircraft design. The lessons learned from examining how all Americans stayed airborne with catastrophic damage informed post-war aircraft development, contributing to safety features and structural requirements that protect crews to this day. Military aviation museums that display B-17 Sound S often include the story of All American in their exhibits, using the famous photographs to illustrate the toughness of the Flying Fortress and the determination of the men who flew them. Aviation historians studying the bomber offensive over Europe inevitably encounter All American's story as an example of what these aircraft and crews endured, a story that captures in a single mission the essence of the strategic bombing campaign's daily reality. And elderly veterans, attending air shows where restored B-17s still fly, point to the graceful four-engine bombers and tell younger generations about the day a Flying Fortress flew home with her tail barely attached, proving that sometimes the impossible is just barely possible enough.